Welcome. I'm David Levi Strauss, chair of the MFA program in art writing here at the School of Visual Arts. Tonight we are very pleased to have Maaza Mengiste with us. She's a writer of fiction and nonfiction whose writings have appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, Granta, The Guardian, Rolling Stone, Guernica, and many other places. Both her fiction and nonfiction works examine the individual lives at stake during migration, war, and exile, and consider the intersections of photography and violence. Her first novel, Beneath the Lion's Gate, opens in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1974, on the eve of a revolution. That novel was selected by The Guardian as one of the 10 best contemporary African books. Her second novel, The Shadow King, is forthcoming. She's also a remarkably lucid photographer, especially of portraits, some of which you can see on Instagram. I was thankfully introduced to her work by Emmanuel Duma and began to follow her commentaries on the politics of photographic images in The Guardian and elsewhere. And those of you who were lucky enough to be here for the student-led conference last May, We Tell Ourselves Stories, the symposium of art, politics, and narrative, got to see her generous and insightful approach in action. We're about to see it again. Please welcome Maaza Mengiste.
I want to preface this with the fact that as I'm reading this, I can't help thinking about what's happening right now with I think the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the way that the news is unfolding. So even, I wrote what I'm going to share with you a little while ago, but I want to frame it within that context because I feel like that's going to be a conversation that we will be having soon, and I think we need to be prepared in terms of how we begin to think about what will happen and how we position ourselves. Okay. There is a saying in Ethiopia, when the one who will be killed is in the presence of the killer, there is freedom. In that moment, there is nothing left to lose. It is possible even to do unheard-of things. I'm in London on a cold November morning, and the last of the 900,000 red poppies will be placed around the Tower of London, one for every soldier from the UK and the Commonwealth who died during the First World War. It is a scorching August day, and the world has fallen silent as a young man in an orange jumpsuit is paraded across a sandy hill and made to kneel. It is April, and another group of young men, Ethiopian like me, are marched across both sand and sea and made to kneel. I turn my head. I close my eyes. I shut my ears. Unheard of things. Chinua Achebe says that all those men in Nazi Germany who put their talent in the service of racism have been generally and rightfully condemned for their perversions. He seems to imply that in the end, true talent cannot be twisted. A gift cannot be subverted and subsumed by evil. That talent is a virtue, stalwart, loyal as a well-trained soldier. Arthur Rimbaud gave up the pretense of poetry, Achebe says, when he opted for slavery. But I have been to Harar, where Rimbaud lived. I have seen some of his belongings. I know that when he put down the pen, he picked up the camera. I have borne witness to his vision of those with skin like mine. There is beauty in the frame. There is poetry. Poetry surely can only be on the side of man's deliverance and not his enslavement, Achebe contends. This I want to believe. Perhaps like some of you here, I have come to this language of English secondhand. I have fallen between its cracks, trying to trudge my way towards comprehension. I have marveled at its flexibility, but never so much as in recent years. What I have seen, what we have seen, is language forced into the service of violence, a rhetoric of desperation and devastation molded into the incomprehensible, then vomited out in images and words that we cannot ignore, though we have tried. It is a language strong enough to reside in troubling landscapes and malleable enough to be both poetic and cruel. It has the capacity to draw us in and push us back and send us spinning with speechless grief. While those red ceramic poppies in London want to remind us of the transcendent power of memory and imagination, the ISIS videos want to drive home that we are in the end no more than our bodies, that we are all interchangeable political symbols knotted around a stoppable heart. Both the installation and the videos demand that we take note and look. In both instances, our gaze is the first step in receiving a prescribed message. Yet to watch the ISIS videos involves a heart-rending complicity with the murderers. Our gaze would be an instrument in the oppression depicted, a continuation of the vulgar narrative. But it is a narrative. It is language. It communicates. It is poetry because it is a language of representation. All those men clad in orange, dragged across sand and sea, have been reduced to brightly colored metaphors. All those poppies, blood red and stuck in dirt around the Tower of London moat, were once full-bodied men strewn across battlefields. One reminds us cruelly of our frailty. The other tries valiantly to shield us from the ugly stink and rot that also makes up who we are. I'm speaking of violence that is put on display. At its most aesthetic, it strips back and erases a harsher reality. At its most garish, it is a billboard for all of our most human and most primal fears, a symbolic language come to us so fully and frightfully formed that we have not always found the words to confront it. When it comes to war, when it comes to violence, it seems that we have not always been able to keep up. We have not always been able to locate the vocabulary that will take us from shock and stunned silence toward a coherent, visceral speech, one as strong as the force that is charging at us. I've long believed in a concerned writer's or artist's need to look at photographs of violence. The power of our particular gaze has the ability to reshape a narrative and turn victim into human being. Then came the videos. Then came the requests by the families of the victims to remember them as they had been, alive and active, rather than as they were intended. Yet in the aftermath of the shock, in the deliberate decision to look away, where is there to settle a gaze when turning away feels like forgetting? To look is to be a pawn in the propaganda. To turn away is its own kind of acquiescence, one that renders these victims as symbols. I know what Achebe is saying. I believe in what he says. I believe that art carries the potential for vast and dramatic change, but it also carries discomfort, and it is by its nature both a tool and a weapon, both a salve and poison. It is not only the righteous woman who holds a gift. It is not only the truth teller who can be heard. If language can withstand and support the heaviest, most brutal of activities, then this is also a testament to its inherent strength, one that can allow us transcendence and peace. But the stakes are high, and though they may be no higher than they have been in other decades and centuries, you and I are here now, in this moment in history, and somewhere in this swirl of unpredictability and ever-shifting alliances is the artist's place. For years I have been searching for that point, that axis on which good seems to pivot too easily towards bad. I want to know where the ground begins to shift and how language both erodes and glues it back together, and what there is to be done about it. I'm talking about our responsibility and duty in the face of these unspeakable and unheard of things. How do we begin to construct a vocabulary if all we can do is stand in numb and silent grief? What is there to really see of those who once stood and then were forced to kneel if all we do is look away? It is Friday, September 16, 2016, and it is close to 11 p.m. I walk into a dark and cavernous room lit only by the dimmest light. I am at an armory converted into a performance space, and I'm here to listen to professional mourners from all over the world: Cambodia, Burkina Faso, China, Colombia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. They're here to take part in artist Terence Simon's exhibit called An Occupation of Loss. Each group of mourners sits in a hollow, silo-shaped structure that opens at the top for their voices to escape. There's a doorway just large enough for me to bend down and step inside so that I can stand in front of them as they sing and lament. I do this because I am curious. I do this because I find Terence Simon's work to be powerful. I do this because once, before the revolution that began in Ethiopia in the 1970s, I used to have 3 uncles. Now they are gone, and my family and I still cannot find the proper way to mourn. The regime that disappeared them and countless others used fear to alter our grief. The former Ethiopian government used grotesque displays of violence to stun us into silence. We learned to stop looking at those they paraded in streets and in squares as examples. We turned away from those 2 awful signs of our own fragility. They never returned some of the bodies. We learned to pretend they were properly buried. And today the loss still sits, waiting for words to make it real. I'm standing in front of 2 Azerbaijani mourners, women dressed in black. The silo is tiny and their eyes are closed. Their faces are lifted to the ceiling. I cannot understand what they are saying, but I understand what they mean. It is there in the way they pound their chests and their voices crack. That first utterance is a cry. It is a long spiraling lament that climbs above my head and ricochets off the ceiling to fall back down. Soon it is suffocating in that cramped space, and I want to leave, but I force myself to stay and follow the path these women have laid in front of me. This is, I think, at that moment where grief finds its voice, in our first cries, our first shouts into the unknown. Yet as the women continue to wail, I begin to realize that it is easy to be trapped by sorrow, that those early signs of mourning can get stuck in an endless cycle. It can spin us in circles, constantly coming back to our first uttered cries of anguish, unless we shift away from what has been lost towards a way to express what must be reclaimed. Fear, I begin to understand, functions like this, in abstraction, hard to wrestle and contain unless we give it form, unless we shine the light into that dark corner and step in to confirm it is ours to dominate. What I mean to say is this: we must force language to carry the weight that we are slowly, horrifyingly realizing it is capable of bearing. But language cannot grow to its full potential if we leave certain words unsaid. If some things are deemed too hideous to understand, if we must distance ourselves from all that does not hold sway to our own beliefs. Fear, like grief, I begin to see as I turn to leave that silo, is a space that is outside of language. It needs no words to flourish. It roots itself in our most incoherent and primal emotions. It gains strength by the nature of its shapelessness, its ability to sit inside of us and expand until it suffocates. Only language gives it form. Words add coherence and move it from abstract expression into an experience that has a beginning and has an end, like a sentence. Thank you. I hope there are a lot of questions. Because as I said, it's this piece has been pretty malleable. I've been adding on to it each time that something seems to happen. And I've been watching I've been watching the way that this administration plays with language and has seemed to take certain words away from us. I know that anytime my inclination to type anything in an email, if I want to say so sad, I can't, because I'm hearing the echo of someone else who has used it. Some words are no longer mine. And I'm also finding, thank you, as this case about Khashoggi's disappearance and what looks like murder is happening, I'm paying attention to the way he's spoken of. I guess the rumor is that there are tapes. I'm just wondering how that's going to play out. So all of this, it feels, this is an unfinished piece. I keep coming back to it and something else keeps happening. So I'd love to hear thoughts and questions, and hopefully this becomes a conversation too. Yeah. I mean, I feel like I'm like the rest of you, I think. When I see those images, you hear the news and you say, what happened? How did this happen? We're stripped of language at that point.
This is Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and we can name countries, and I think that one of the things I've been wondering about is the very quick reference that we have to Nazi Germany, and I wonder if that stops the conversation in terms of what do we do now, what can we do, not to argue with you about the horror of it, but I'm looking at those analogies and saying, I don't know what to do when I say that. But when I think about if this is an American problem, this is a problem that's as American as anything. The founding of this country was based on separation of children from families.
Children of color.
Pardon? Well, Native American. It did not begin just in Nazi Germany, and we can look at what happened to enslaved peoples and families. This is an American story, and I think once we claim that, we can begin to find a way to talk about it. Whereas I find the analogy that I did the same thing. It's Nazi Germany. I said, wait a minute. Then it stops me, because that's a problem that was there, but this is a new thing. But to claim this as an American problem then forces a reckoning with history and makes all of us responsible. And that's where I am right now with that. Not to take away from the horror of it, but to say that we need the historical perspective has to broaden. Though I agree with you in some ways, it does echo that. Like not this conversation, so that the next time someone's inclination is to say it's like this, and it's not rooted in American soil, then we can stop the conversation and say, wait, actually, it's been happening ever since this country. The soil in this country remembers the people, the same thing that you're doing right now, that you and I are doing, having this conversation, I think makes a difference. Because unfortunately, it's happened everywhere. Disappearances happened in Ethiopia. It's been happening, but we've somehow shielded ourselves as Americans in erasing that history, and we've forgotten a lot of it. I mean, this feels almost like the task that we've set ourselves as writers, as artists, and it feels now that it's more urgent. And maybe people, 50 years ago felt that same kind of urgency, but we're here now, and it feels really urgent when you have children who are still separated. I say drone on until somebody, people, it's not, I think we're also falling we're in the moment where everybody needs to be entertained. And if things are not said quickly enough, or is said in a certain way to grab our attention, we lose attention. And I've noticed, I mean, this is, I think, the part of the internet era of quick clicks and reading headlines and moving. And I consciously have to train myself to be patient now with things. I'm constantly telling myself to slow down, because it may not, and I don't, you know, if someone's droning, let them drone if they're saying something that needs to be heard. But I also find that sometimes my tendency is, well, it's not getting me in the first 3 seconds, so I need to move, I need to turn. We're seeing that the administration functions like that with the tweets that's coming out of the White House. And our job, which is also the work of art that we do, the work of writing that we do, is to force time into, like, to force it to be still so we can capture something and look at it and analyze it. I know in my writing, my job is to control time, not let it control me. And I think that's also the work of art, the work of artists. You're in control of time when you're standing in front of whatever medium that you use. And you can speed it up and slow it down based on the way that you work, based on the way I write. I can make one paragraph, I can make 50 years happen in that paragraph. Or I can make 1 second happen in that paragraph. Time is mine to control. But there's a patience that we've lost because of the rapidness of news, current events, of just one horror after another. I take breaks quite literally from the internet, from Twitter. I'm not on Facebook anymore. Because I have to make myself capable of compassion and sensitivity again. And I will lose that if I'm constantly allowing myself to be bombarded with images. Frankly, it's always first the image. So my novel will be published next year. I now have a date, which means I'm terrified of deadlines. Speaking of time and controlling it, I don't control this. So I'm in the middle of deadlines and editing right now. But my process, the book is set in World War II, and one of the characters is a soldier who takes his camera to war. And so I've been working a lot with images. A lot of them I've collected on my own and then figured out how to use them to inspire parts of the storyline and how to work with them without putting the image into the book. My process has always begun with image. It just has. From the moment, before I even realized that writing was something I wanted to do seriously, it's always begun with image and then moved on into words. I don't know what other kind of process, but it's, for me, been a constant refining of the image I see in my head. And in the book, the novel, it describes through word image the photographs that this photographer, this soldier, takes. And often what I've realized with that is, I mean, one of the questions that I've asked myself when I'm working that way is to think about the knowledge that's embedded within the frame and then what's outside of the frame that the photographer knows that forces an angle or forces the lighting. So it's the way that the visual creates a narrative, if that makes sense. So it's I've been really very invested in it, but really buried in it lately. That the kind of translation. I don't know if that made sense, but thanks. Orwell, in his essay "Politics of the English Language," talks about how the image comes first before the words. That before we know how to write cat, we know what it is. We imagine something when we're writing it, and then we put it into words. And that always felt to me like that process felt right. I've had other writers disagree, but that's fine. But when I read that, I said, oh, that makes sense. That's kind of the way that I work. Yeah. Other. Is that a hand? Oh no. I think, one of the things maybe to talk about here also is, I've said this thing about the ISIS videos, and then, but I've had conversations with friends, and this is something that I'm still trying to work through, and that we're still trying to work through in casual conversations, is that where does this thinking, I feel the need that we have to look at these images that depict violence, because we can then transform what we are, victims that are supposed to scare us or deter us into actual human beings. But then you have the videos of Mike Brown, and you have the police brutality that's captured on video. And this is an ongoing conversation that I've been having with several people about our place as writers and artists in that kind of viewing, which feels very different to me in some way. And I'd love to hear thoughts. I don't think this is done as a national conversation either.
I don't understand. It feels different from what?
From this idea that I was talking about the need to look at images of violence. And I've had friends of mine say, well, haven't we seen enough Black men, women, killed on video? Like, what do we do with those images? How do we balance that with this? What's the difference? This idea of how these questions are individual. We can't look at everything. And that's part of that numbing process. But what is it that you will claim as yours, that becomes yours? Whether it's because of a country, or maybe it's a situation, or it's some other way to define what your community will be as a writer, as an artist, in this kind of conversation. And I think then, I really think that the looking is only the first step. Like Emmanuel is also saying, that's the beginning. And then it becomes a process of claiming and acknowledging and asking ourselves whatever questions about why is this drawing me in. I had a similar experience that I'm still grappling with, and I'm still trying to figure out how to write, and frankly still trying to look at some of the images. When several years ago there was a prison guard from Syria, codenamed Caesar, smuggled out, I think, about 15,000 photographs that he had to take of prisoners and victims from these prisons where he worked. And he had these thousands of images, and he brought them, I think, to the UN. And I went to the UN to see that. I think, David, we talked about this, and Emmanuel, we went together to see them. But when they were first out, the Guardian had, it was in the news, and the Guardian had a few of the images, and there was a black square over some of the wounds and the faces, so you couldn't see. And I think there might have been maybe 6 images, and I could only click on the first one, even with that black square. And I couldn't do it, as much as I was thinking about these things, and I was in the process of writing something about it, which I have never been able to write yet. And then when we went to the UN exhibit, and we're walking through this, and you can see the photographs are blown up, and you can see it, and it was a very visceral reaction. And I looked then, but I realized that I was completely bereft of language. I still don't have the language to articulate what I saw or what I felt feel still about them. Those were things where language has just, it completely feels useless to me. But I think a place to start, and David, you and I were talking a little bit, I think I came to your office after this, I can't remember. But I remember asking a UN employee why they set them up in this hallway that was all the way in the back, and you had to have a UN pass. We got in because my cousin let us in. But, why, it wasn't for everybody. It wasn't for the general public. And so you have these images, but then no one could see them except people who worked at the UN who happened to walk down this hallway. And it turns out that they had set up these pictures so that all of the Syrian diplomats would have to pass those images on their way to whatever meetings that they were going to go. So that was really for them. And I asked the UN, well, why are you doing this? He said, to shame them. Exactly, and so there's a power that's implied in these images that I don't think it worked. Clearly, no, we know this now, but there's this idea that was imbued into these pictures, that if you looked at these and you were from that country, you were a diplomat, part of Assad's regime, there's this emotion that you should have. But, it brings in all these questions about shame, responsibility, accountability, all these things that these pictures were supposed to be shorthand for that I think failed. But then there's also another question, and I remember talking to someone about why didn't you open this up for the public? And they said, well, you can't show this to the public. And my thought was, what is it that we haven't seen at this point? And I think this was a conversation that David, you and I were having about, we've seen everything. I don't know what the Holocaust did not show us. I don't know what images from Civil War or what happened, these battlefields, I don't know what has not been shown us, and what it is that we think we are protecting each other from or ourselves from. It feels to me like we've seen everything. So those were questions that these pictures have still bring up. I haven't figured out how to write about what I saw, though. This is really where words have left me with that, except the magnitude of what happened to human beings is overwhelming. But that's not enough to say. And this is where the artist and the writer has to keep going and looking and looking and looking and looking, and when the process becomes deeply personal, so we can break the horror apart and then find the words. And I haven't gotten there yet. I don't know how to move beyond the horror of it. I don't know how to move beyond the horror of what happened to individuals. And I'm stuck in the face of that, just standing there saying, my God. But I don't know how to move beyond that. And that's the work of writing. Writing will get me there. But I have to be willing to sit. And maybe, I don't know if I need to look at them again, but I have notes that I took. And it's interesting looking back at my notes that my first tendency was to speak in metaphor, because I couldn't attack it directly with words. I couldn't do it. And so that for me is part of a process that I'm still working through. And I think that's that's what happens. This is why we turn. We turn away through metaphor or through nice images. But I think what we need to do is sit and face it until we find a way to re-describe it, so it transcends the horror without blunting it. There are times when we will see these images, and it may not be the image that we respond to, even though we needed to see it, but there's a representation of that we might be able to use to work our way through, like that bridge that you're talking about. Yeah, that's good. I have the entire set that was this big, that was published last year. And I was reading the drowned and the saved, the drowned and the damned, the drowned and the saved, the drowned and the saved. And I actually wrote a piece based on that book or that essay in relation to the photograph that became famous of the little boy Alan Kurdi that had drowned and then whose body had washed up on shore. So yeah, I like that one. But Primo Levi is the whole set is heavy to carry around, but I've been reading him more, and I think also I've gone back to At the Mind's Limit by Jean-Marie, and that essay where he speaks about his experiences. I believe it was in Auschwitz. And how language left him, and what happened to him, and his sense of himself and his body the first time he was interrogated and the first hit, and how that reminded him, oh my God, I'm a body. But because he was still alive and he could still do it, it actually gave him a charge, like, wow, I can do this, until they kept going and kept going. But that essay is it's a beautiful, beautiful essay, At the Mind's Limit. And the entire book of his, the collection of essays is incredible. But he speaks a lot about language, and it left him as a prisoner. But it left him because he was an intellectual. It did not leave people that he knew who were also prisoners there, who were not intellectuals, who were craftsmen, carpenters, mechanics. They had the language to deal with what was happening. And he explains a lot of that, whereas as a philosopher, he had language left him, which I find really interesting. Yeah, which is really, actually, no pun intended, but it's a wonderful note to end on, because it's, we're talking about ways to transform. Words are not only to represent or to mimic, but how do we transform what we have noticed or seen into something larger, something that transcends that particular moment where that incident occurred, to something that can carry forth and actually become stronger than the initial moment. Thank you all. That's great.